Hey everyone, welcome. I'm Miguel Jimenez. I'm the founder and director of the Lit Luz Book Club. Hola, ¿qué tal todos? Yo soy Miguel Jimenez. Soy el fundador y director del Club de Lectura Lit Luz. Tonight's event will be in English. However, we have a simultaneous translation live available for you. It's really easy. If you want to access that, you can click the link below the video. It'll take you into a Zoom session where you'll receive the live translation. I'll say that now to our Spanish speaking audience. Hola, ¿qué tal todos? Si necesitan, si quieren traducción simultánea, la tenemos de inglés al español. Es muy fácil de acceder. Solo tienen que hacer clic al enlace que está debajo del video y ese enlace los llevará a una sesión de Zoom donde recibirán la traducción simultánea en vivo. So I'll let everyone get situated, access that translation. In the meantime, you get your drink ready, whatever beverage you have with you, and then we'll begin. So we're here tonight to discuss Nate Marshall's new book, Finna Poems. It's a book that has been described as a lyrical and sharp celebration of the Black vernacular, its influence of pop culture, its necessity for familial survival, its role in storytelling, and in creating the safety found only within intimacy. It's intimacy. So we're here with two incredible guests. So I'm just going to introduce them and get this conversation going. Nate Marshall is an award-winning writer, rapper, educator, and editor. He is the author and editor of numerous works, including Wild Hundreds, Finna Poems, and the Breakbeat Poets, New American Poetry in the Age of Hip Hop. Nate is a member of the Dark Noise Collective and co-directs Crescendo Literary. He is an assistant professor of English at Colorado College. He is from the South Side of Chicago. We're also joined by Jamila Woods, an incredible singer, songwriter, and poet. In 2016, she released her debut album, Heaven, followed by the 2019 release of her second solo album, Legacy, where each song is influenced and titled after an artist of color, from James Baldwin to Frida Kahlo. And just last Friday, she blessed us with the release of the song Sula hardcover and video. You guys got to check that out, which is available for listening and purchase on all listening platforms. You can also find her poetry in multiple journals and in the anthology Breakbeat Poets, New American Poetry in the Age of Hip Hop. Jamila also edited the poetry anthology, The Breakbeat Poets, Volume 2, Black Girl Magic. And she, too, is part of the Dark Noise Collective. So without further ado, please welcome into your computers, your whatever device you're using, into your homes. Welcome, Nate and Jamila.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Nate.
What's up? How you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you doing?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm here. I'm alive. Yes.
That's good. It's the beginning of our season, Libra season.
Yes. What are you doing for your birthday that you can't leave the house for? Or maybe you will leave the house. I don't know.
I have no idea. I haven't gotten there yet. But for today, I just dressed and I put flowers on the table for aesthetics. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. I'm really excited to talk about your book, though.
Thank you. I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm curious to know, because I know we've talked a lot about like second projects or like sophomore projects and the ways that after you put out your first book or your first album or your first thing, you not only have to contend with just creating again, but like creating in a world that already has an expectation based on something else that you've done. So I'm curious, like, what were the fears that you had while writing the book, and maybe how did those fears evolve, if they did, after the book's out in the world?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, there definitely were sort of those fears, and I'm trying to think about how they kind of manifest. I mean, okay, so one thing I think I always have to sort of remind myself is that, like, a lot of is that from an artistic perspective, I live in a social world that is not representative of things. And so, yeah, and so sometimes, like, I think a lot of people, it's really natural to sort of compare yourself, even without meaning to your friends or just to the people you're in community with. And I always have to remind myself, like, that I'm in community with some of the, like, like, people who folks will be studying decades from now, if like people still exist or whatever. So yes, I mean, absolutely, like, that is a thing I think that applies pressure, like, to think about, like, all the sort of great things that Dinesh did on a craft level with their second book, like, to think about sort of what you did with Legacy. Yeah, just sort of that kind of thing. Like, that was I definitely in my head. I'd be a liar to say it wasn't. Just being like, yeah, I can't. Yeah, if I come whack, like, people gonna talk about me. I don't know. So that was a part of it. But I guess in terms of how it's changed since the book came out, I think I've just been surprised that people are, like, engaging with the book at the level that they are, right? Like, that it has so many kind of reviews and, folks posting about it and all that kind of stuff. And so that, I think, has been, like, really sort of humbling. And, in some ways, for me, the easiest part of a book is once it's in the world, because it's just not mine anymore. Like, I feel like that's the point at which I get to sort of step away from the full responsibility of the thing, because like, if it's, because I'm done. Like, I did what it is. I did my thing, and now it's sort of over.
Yeah, I feel that. I think I've been thinking a lot about my relationship to criticism or even like interpretation of things that I do, because I like to believe that I can be like, it's out in the world, like, I don't care. But sometimes certain things I've noticed have, like, stuck in my head, like, oh, like, it's being talked about as protest music, or it's being talked about in this way. And, like, sometimes I notice that influencing how I respond, and I want to be aware that it's not like that, it's in a positive way, that, okay, it's giving me a prompt for how I can do something a little bit more vulnerable this time, or something like that. Because I like something that you said. I think you said, like, with your first book, Wild Hundreds, you noticed maybe white audiences in particular calling it a sad story. And, like, how that kind of shifted you with Finna to think about your audience as, like, just talking to Black people, and, like,
Yeah.
fuck what other people think. And I feel like a similar, not maybe in a different way, like with Heaven, I noticed it was often just talked about in one way.
Yeah.
I felt like I was also telling a very personal story, but it became a very just, like, kind of more like only the political, and not seeing, like, the connection there. And so, yeah, I guess I'm always thinking about that. Like, so I don't know if you think about that too, just how the conversation can affect your process too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think certainly, like, this has been my experience of bringing a book out kind of in this moment of so-called racial reckoning in the US and beyond. And, like, and I imagine it was sort of similar for you with Heaven, because that record came out, like, was it like summer
2016, 17, kind of.
Yeah. So this is, like, kind of in the like aftermath of Laquan McDonald in Chicago, and, like, all of these kinds of things. But I think, like, what always happens when you're, like, maybe it's being a Black artist specifically, maybe it's being a sort of, like, minoritized artist broadly, because I think about, like, the reception of, like, Jose Olivares's book Citizen Illegal. But, like, yeah, people always want to talk about your shit as, like, timely, as, like, oh, this is so time. And I'm like, dog, I've been writing these, like, I've been working on this for years.
I was thinking about Black people the other day.
Right. Like, and I think that's the thing that is, like, hard for people sometimes. It's like, yeah, you just started thinking about these things. This is, like, a part of how I existentially approach the world, right? Like, I'm not, I'm never not this. And so I don't know. It's definitely a thing I'm aware of, but I think in some ways it's like I kind of have to like take it in stride because I recognize like it's sort of a part of the way that people engage with art, and part of that comes from the fact that I think we don't, as a society, necessarily have very good or precise language to talk about art and talk about what moves us and why. And so we use these sort of like broad terms. And so I don't get mad at that. I'm just sort of clocking it, right? Like just last night, I got into like an argument with, I don't like a lot of Twitter, apparently like hundreds of people.
Lupe versus Kendrick.
Yeah. And the idea, like the sort of thing is people were like, oh, who's more lyrical, Lupe or Kendrick? And I'm like, this is absurd. Kendrick is a far better artist. And it's like not even really fair to Lupe to like compare him in this way. And when I say that, and whatever, like this is sort of off the map, but like I'm like, right, when people talk about hip hop, they always talk about being lyrical, but nobody knows what that means. It basically, like, we basically use lyrical to say I like this person better than most other people, or better than a lot of other people. Whatever. It's a word that doesn't mean anything, which is fine, but like, can we like be more precise in the language? Because I think like what people were saying was that like if Lupe and Kendrick were in a cipher, Lupe would have more ways to impress you. And that I'm more or less buy, but like I don't actually care because he's not in a cipher. He makes albums for a living. And Kendrick makes better ones. So why are we talking about it?
That's interesting. That's interesting because thinking about the spectrum between lyrical and narrative and poetry, I don't know if it's similar in rap or not, because it seems like the lines get more blurry.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think this is like, maybe this is part of why I have this kind of weird, like, averse reaction to people sort of blindly calling things lyrical when they want to say that this is of a high quality and I appreciate it, is because, you know, like studying and teaching poetry, like lyric has a specific meaning.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, so like I'm aware of that meaning. I'm aware that like lyric means a specific thing in that context, or in the context of like music, lyric has a specific meaning. And so I don't understand what you're describing when you say something or someone is lyrical. And then, yeah, I don't know. Sometimes I'm like, maybe I just read too much to like, I don't mean that to be like elitist or anything, but like maybe I'm like thinking too much about all the ways, the meanings that this word does hold, to like, yeah, to like have that
conversation. Yeah,
I don't know.
That makes me think though. I noticed a few allusions to songs, or what I thought were allusions to songs, like through the book, and just thinking about the idea of sampling and like legibility and like the audience that you're speaking to in your book. And I know sometimes like when I'm working in music, I'm like, oh, I wish it could be more like poetry, where all you have to do is like write down a note in the back of your book, like this comes from Nikki Giovanni, and not like pay a bunch of money to the
really.
But I noticed that there isn't like a notes, you know, it's kind of just like very subtly, like if you know the allusion, you're going to know it in your book. And so I was wondering if you could just speak to that, like if that was how conscious that was in your process.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for me, it's like maybe because I sort of grew up listening to a lot of hip hop and writing rhymes and sort of thinking in that way of making, is that hip hop is such an elusive form, right? So like, you know, like, yeah, like you think about all of the lines that people sort of lift from someone like Biggie, or you think of the way that like, even Biggie, when he says, I'm not only the client, I'm the player president, he's referencing like this popular ad from like Hair Club for Men from like the 80s, but everyone who's listening to him is going to sort of know that. But people listening to him now aren't going to know that, but they're still going to be like, oh, that's like a fly line, right? They're just going to take it as a thing. Yeah, I don't know. I think maybe, and part of it is I think just lyrical, right? It's the when it's just the words, when you're not carrying melody, like those sort of usages are just different. So you can kind of just sit them there and just like let them rock and not have to like pay anyone or whatever. And you know, at least depending on how much you're using. And so I think that's just a really natural part of my process. So much so that sometimes I don't always even keep track of all of the things. So like I made a playlist on Spotify sort of all of the songs and artists that I reference in the book. And I kind of had to like go back through the book to see it. And there were like things that I had forgot that I had like caught. I'm like, oh, right. There's like this random in like one of the poems, like one of the lines is when I'm alone in my room. And for me, when I'm alone in my room always echoes when I'm alone in my room. Sometimes I stare at the wall and in the back of my mind, I hear my conscience call. It's always LL Cool J, I Need Love. You know.
Yeah, that's in Scruples.
Yeah.
How did you think about using form and invented forms too in this project?
Yeah. I mean, you know, I love form. Like, I think one for me, like, again, like hip hop and just the rap verse is in some ways like the most rigorous contemporary form that exists, right? It's certainly in conversation with, you know, with something like, I mean, the only thing I can think of that really has a similar sort of rigor to it would maybe be like that, man, what do you think? The duplex that like Jericho Brown kind of created and has a bunch of in his last book. But like, so yeah, so I think once I realized that about form, it was much easier for me to approach every poem thinking, okay, what is the form of this poem, right? And sometimes that form is like, you know, something kind of official like a sonnet or a sestina or whatever. And sometimes it's just like, oh, this is a poem that sort of revolves around, there's not one in the book like this, but I'm like writing a poem that revolved around like a cuss word. And so every line had, every stanza had 4 lines, right? Because it was like, and a lot of the lines were 4 words long because, you know, how do we refer to cuss words euphemistically? We call them 4-letter words, right? And so that 4 was like important. Yeah, I wanna bite this thing. Maybe I'll never do it, but I'll drop it for the people. I wanna if you know the what do you call that? The phrase like ACAB or ACAB. I want to do a poem that's just like where that's just the rhyme scheme throughout the poem.
Oh yeah, all cops are bastards. Poem.
Yeah, hilarious to me.
People need it, I think. Oh, awesome. I was also thinking about, I was curious if your editing process for this book, because the project of this book, you talked a lot about it being important that you weren't just this hero protagonist of the book, that you could be flawed and you're a person who has privileges and, you know, who uses language that can be oppressive or these things, and just complicating that idea of the protagonist being so beloved. And with that, I guess I was curious because I know I taught this summer program at Young Chicago Authors, and you came into the critique session, and to a lot of the students, we were telling them almost like, I ended up calling it like reading for power, like going through your poem and like, is someone being made a victim in your poem, and how can they be humanized? Is someone a villain? How can they be humanized? And I'm wondering if you had some element of that in your editing process, because it seemed like there was even like thinking of the other Nate Marshall poems, or the poem about the woman in your family who dated your grandfather. I can't remember that name of that poem, but there's some poems with complex characters. So I was wondering how you thought about that.
Yeah, that's a good ass question. I think in some ways it really is a part of the genesis of the book, right? So with this book, I started writing this book like late 2015, early 2016. And so, like what's happening in that moment, there's a bunch of things, right? Like one is I was like leaving a relationship that, and in some ways like the dissolution of that relationship, I think made me had to like look in a hard way at myself and say like, what kind of person do you really want to be when it comes to how you like, just how you like love people, right? Romantically, but in all sorts of ways, right? Simultaneously to that, I'm also in my first, I was in my first like sort of full-time teaching gig at Wabash College in like sort of rural Indiana. And that was interesting because I was in these classrooms where I had a lot of kids who were first generation students, were like the sons, it's all male school, right? Which is interesting, which I think like colors the sort of book's engagement with gender. Like it felt like a part of my responsibility in some ways, just coming out of that space that I needed to talk thoughtfully about gender. But also like, I'm dealing with a lot of the white kids are like first gen kids from like small towns. And, this is like as the Republican like primary was happening. And I see kids like coming in with like Trump hats and stickers and all this sort of stuff, right? And they're kids that like I'm cool with. They're like in my classes and they're great. They love Professor Marshall, whatever, right? And so I think what that made me do is I think I had a much more complicated relationship to the notion of a Trump supporter or to the notion of like some of these things than some of my other friends like back home. Because yeah, it's sort of easy to say like, yo, fuck Trump and whoever fucks with him when you don't know any of those people. And I'm not saying that. I'm like, that's still ultimately the thought, but I do have to like reckon with the fact that those people are people and also that those people aren't entirely stupid. Right? Like a sort of key thing I've been thinking about a lot is that people are not dumb. People can be deceived and whatever, but like often we talk about people sort of like voting against their own interests or like moving against their own interests. And I don't think that that's true. I think like maybe it's true on some like larger levels, but I think often we misunderstand people's interests. Part of why we can like say that in this way, like how deeply patronizing is that to say to like some like you've lived in a city your whole life, like to tell some cat who's like been working as a pig farmer, he's like a fourth generation pig farmer, to say, yeah, you don't understand your own interests. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, you sound goofy. And so that's like, yeah, so whatever. All that was there. I think it was sort of in the poems. And then in terms of editing, it occurred to me that the character of the sort of other Nate Marshall, who's this kind of white supremacist figure, was like useful, not just because he's like funny, because it's like funny that there's a white supremacist with the same name as me, but also because he's someone who it's sort of easy for people to like think bad things about. And so for me, part of the thing I was thinking about in the book was like, how do I complicate that? Because the easy thing is to be like, this dude is racist, fuck him. But like, what happens when I start to like collapse, the sort of character of him and the character of me into maybe a single character? Or what happens when I start to like do things that might extend him some grace or the possibility of redemption or whatever? Because ultimately, like, for a lot of us that are like right now talking and thinking through more like radical ways of being and relating to each other in the world, whether that's like defunding the police or, dismantling the sort of like criminal industrial complex or abolishing ICE, like all of these sort of notions, like ultimately what that's about is like relating to people in a way other than punishment and other than saying, you did a bad thing or you thought a bad thing or whatever, and so that's the final word on you. And I'm like, that doesn't just get to be a one-way street, you know.
Yeah, challenging the idea of disposability.
Mm-hmm.
Really powerful. I was also noticing the way that the conversation around consent comes up in the book, and that also, I feel like you took a really nuanced, kind of holistic approach to that, because I think right now, especially post Me Too, but really before that too, is like emphasis on men, or cis het men needing to understand what consent is and how they can get it, versus like also how they can know that they are capable of like giving it or not giving it for themselves. So yeah, I just thought that in terms of like the couple times that comes up in the poems, I thought that, and also the lesson, the uncle's parable on consent, the idea of like, for me, I read it as like that iron image, as like, if you touch something without knowing if you're supposed to, that can also impact you. And it also made me think of like just that the whole notion of harm doers to, even whether it's like, a white supremacist, or dehumanizing someone else in a way is also dehumanizing to the person. So
I mean, yeah, I think about like, so one of my like very like good friends through like my graduate school experience, like a few years after that, we were working together at this point, like they, there was like a series of accusations of like sexual assault with them, right? And so, and I think this is one of the weird things about assault that we don't often think about, is like, one, like the way that harm sort of ripples out in ways that we don't always account for well, and also the way that and like, in the case of that, like that person, like I had to sort of mourn that I had like lost this friendship, right? And this friendship that was like deeply sustaining for me through a really difficult time of transition. But if I sort of take a step back, like I lost one friend, that person lost like probably scores of friends, which is not to say that, that's not warranted or whatever, but is to say that like, I think this notion that the terrible things we do don't impact us is like, it's just wrong. It's like sort of wrong-headed. And maybe it's very Western in its way, because we sort of think we can always like push it off or push it down the line. And maybe you can for a bit, but like, chickens do come home to roost eventually, to paraphrase Malcolm. But yeah, I guess, I mean, I think, a thing I've been struggling with for the last bunch of years, especially again, like being in that space where I was teaching primarily young men, or exclusively young men in those classrooms, was like, like so much of how young men are trained to talk and think about sex and courtship and wooing, right? What like the old Southern folks would call pitching woo, like all that stuff is about sort of deception. Like it all, like the whole idea of game is about like deception and coercion. And
I'm not good at it.
Yeah, but it's frightening, right? It's like tremendously frightening. And one of the scariest things about it is like, often like it's so embedded that we don't recognize when it happens to us, or we're not able to name it when it happens to us, and maybe happens to us in ways that we're not comfortable with, right? So like one of the poems that you sort of reference, is about this experience that I had like as a young, probably 13 or 14 or something like that. And it was this story I had been telling for like a decade as a kind of like, conquering like sex story that was sort of funny. And then I realized like, oh wait, this woman like engaged with me and I never said yes. She never asked me. Like, I did have sort of weird feelings about it, but I also like buried those because I recognized that there was a social script to that that if someone, as a man, like if someone who is, you know, presumably attractive to you, whatever, is engaging you, then you're supposed to want it and you're supposed to be a sort of like gung-ho participant in that. And I was like, oh, like, man, I've never been given the space to say no. And and most young men are never given that space to say no. And that's part of the reason maybe why like so often there's this epidemic of like men being unable to like give anyone else the space to say no. It's like, oh yeah, because that was some shit not afforded to them.
Mm.
And so like there's a like that has a cost, you know?
Yeah, definitely. I think another thing, I remember hearing you, maybe it was like in the Versus interview or a while ago when you were, I think, just starting to write the book, talk about the way that you started out writing about language, but then realized that like with language is laced with violence, but then also this potential to, especially Black language, to reinvent and like transform and kind of like talk about possibility.
Mhm.
So I guess, yeah, just thinking about that last section of the book, and kind of where I think it's always a hard question, like where do you leave off, you know? But I really liked how that last section just kind of does justice, I think, to the how I think about Black language as like it's always
Right.
evolving, and there's always like this space where, contrary to what people might think, it's inventive and like always kind of there's potential for it to be radical in a lot of ways, even as it's seen as, oh, that's not grammatically correct, or you know, Black people are homophobic and like behind what's liberal, you know.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, which is so dumb. It's such a dumb idea. But yeah, I mean, I think that, how can I say? I, f- I feel like there's a way in which, um, yeah, like we often don't take responsibility for the ways that our language can harm. Um, and so that was the thing I was trying to do in the book. But I think also with that, it was important for me to sort of do this kind of mapping project of like, oh, well, where are the ways in which like language has actually like offered me some possibility, right? Whether that's like a possibility to connect with people, a possibility to sort of think through the world differently, et cetera, right? Like I remember when our homie, our sort of mutual friend H Melt, when they transitioned, right, and like began to like step into they them pronouns, and initially like that was difficult for me, not because I was like, yeah, absolutely, but I would just trip up, right? And the thing that sort of tripped me out was I was like, oh, the thing that helped me kind of get past that and stop doing that, was I thought back to when I was on the basketball court as a kid growing up, and for whatever reason, we always use they. Like everyone's sort of pronoun was gender neutral, and I had no idea why. Um, but I was just like, oh, if I'm just like sort of approach this like thinking like I'm playing ball on like 116th and Morgan, like I'm good.
mm,
And that was like, and I think a lot of people wouldn't think about that, right? They wouldn't really, you know, yeah, they wouldn't consider like, well, where are the places where language does offer people like more space to live in ways that are like fully affirming, but perhaps outside of this kind of like, you know, white cis hetero, et cetera norm. Um, yeah.
yeah. Where do you feel like your head is at now, like after putting this out, and I know you're probably reading from it like every day now.
Yeah.
Are you thinking about what you want to write next?
A little bit. I mean, I'm thinking a little bit about what I want to write next. I have like a kind of novel idea that I've been playing around with for some years. And so I'm thinking about approaching that, but I realize like I just don't know if I know enough to do it. And so I'm starting to kind of reinstitute like a daily writing practice, but also, um, but also like really reinvest in my reading.
Mm-hmm.
And so like I just started reading Colson Whitehead's most recent novel. And I like bought a bunch of other books to kind of check out. And then I'm also like I'm reading like some things that I think will challenge me just out of curiosity. Like there's this sort of group of like old dead white dudes who called the Fugitive Poets, who are like in Nashville in like the 1920s and 30s or whatever, and are sort of very influential, right? They also were a bunch of fucking racists, right? Like one dude was on the White Citizens Council. They were very like pro the sort of antebellum South and whatever. And so I'm reading this like literary biography from like 1965 of a dude that loved them.
Mm.
Because I'm like, I just want to know what this cat says. I want to know like how he is sort of dealing or thinking through or talking about or not talking about these very clear issues for me. Yeah, I'm like just curious. So I'm like, I think that's more so than like thinking about the next product I want to produce. I'm like really excited that I get to sort of be curious in this way again.
Yeah, the marination period.
Yeah.
The best.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you.
All right, so we're going to move into a Q&A with Nate. We're taking questions from the chat box, so if you want to submit some questions, please do. We already have some questions here that people have been submitting, and some from last night. We had a book club meeting. Folks in the city read your book, Nate, so we have a few questions in here. Yeah. So I have a few questions from that conversation last night. And again, folks, if you want to submit some in the chat box, please do. But I'm gonna be a little selfish, Nate. I'm gonna ask you a question that I have.
Yeah.
One of the things that moved me the most when I was reading your book was the organization of it. So I'm really like, I have poet friends too, and like sometimes I see them laying out their poems on the floor and like figuring out how they're gonna organize it. When I was reading it, I felt like I was almost doing like this sort of scan of the poet, and we started with names and moved into questions of like, who's Nate, of home, of Chicago, of the body, of survival. So I'm curious about what your process was organizing these poems.
Yeah. That's like my favorite part of putting together a book, actually. Like I sort of have like gotten into book editing. And honestly, the primary reason why I think I've gotten interested in book editing is because it allows me to like relive my favorite part of putting together a project more often than I could actually produce a book of poems. But yeah, I appreciate that question. I think it's a bunch of things for me. Like some of it is, sometimes there are poems that it's very clear to me, like, oh, this kind of has to like start something or end something, right? Either the whole book or maybe a section. And so I kind of will like start with those things. And then there's also sometimes poems where I have a strong impulse that they belong together. They belong like next to each other in the book. Because they, for whatever reason, it could be that they are sort of in sync, or because I think, they provide a contrast with each other that I think is productive. But I do the kind of like laying the thing out. And then the last thing, well, and then I do a bunch of like readings of the book. So I actually read the thing out loud. Like that's the last part of in the editing process is I read the whole book out loud in a single sitting. And I kind of mark up from there. But another thing that I'll do is almost like I think I got it from like just like seeing like shows being sort of produced, right? Like if you've ever done like I'm sure you've done like in terms of like doing stuff with Lit Luz or whatever, where you'll do a tech rehearsal and the tech rehearsal is like kind of first line, last line.
Yeah.
So that like your AV folks know where to mark things and know how to set the lighting and all that. And so I'll do a first line, last line read of every poem through the book to see like, okay, what's the language? How is that language connecting, from piece to piece? Like just that, like if we sort of wash away most of the poems, but we just leave that, like how's it connecting? And that's really helpful for me in like thinking about the book. Also like the last section I think is important because I do think that I wouldn't say it's a sad book, but I think there are hard poems in the book and certainly sad moments. And so for me, it was important to have the last section not be a bummer. Like not to feel sort of like corny or trite, but to feel like it could reach towards some kind of optimism or some kind of possibility in a way that wasn't like naive, right? In a way that felt like, okay, I've come through this whole book, I've come through this journey that was at times difficult, but I feel like I can step forward from that, right? Which I think is like the thing, that's what you want to feel when you like go through anything that kind of sucks,
There's that, that's funny because there actually comes a question here from someone, Victoria here talks about, says Black futurity really stood out for me in these poems, looking at how slang goes back to hundreds of years and has been passed on to today, how a word like finna looks onward, and thinking of that, I couldn't help but to think of what's happening to Black folks in this country today and the Black lives murdered in recent months. I wondered how these poems spoke to all that. And if I remember correctly, this question comes from last night. This person, and I think the group was also talking about how, and you mentioned it right now, this sort of like, it didn't feel passive. It felt like work throughout that process. Like, so the hope that you were just talking about, it seemed like it didn't feel like this passive hope, like you were saying, right? Like not this like sort of like rosy, hopeful thing. So I'm wondering, and I think this question is asking if you could speak to that idea of hope as a discipline. It says, that there's that Marian Kava quote in there. So the question is, can you talk about those poems in relation to like hope as discipline or that Marian Kava idea?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I think, I have a lot of respect for the kind of work that Marian does. And so, I guess like speaking to sort of my understanding of that as a notion and why I've always been sort of attracted to that since I heard it is, I think some of what it says is that like, it's not easy to think that the worst thing might not happen, right? Because in so many ways, like the worst thing, one is often the thing that is happening currently, and it's also the thing that has the sort of like force of a lot of like power behind it, right? I think about the way that environmental degradation has, really the force of our entire economy behind it, right? Or these kind of like the xenophobic like scapegoating of immigrants has, the force of the society behind it, right? And so it's not easy to like sort of move against that force and say, yeah, I could be like, it doesn't have to be that way, or like it could, like we're gonna work so that it isn't that way, forever, right? And that's hard. It's like exhausting, right? Like I think one of the things that's been really fascinating for me in this summer is the way in which is like, yeah, the way it was this kind of summer of reckoning, or the summer of like, I think people who had not thought actively about a lot of social issues, then now having to sort of think about them and be confronted by them. And for me, and it was hearing how exhausted people were by that. And I'm like, yeah, it's exhausting. That's why it's a discipline. And that's why it's like actually important that you are sort of like disciplined in your approach to like these kinds of issues of injustice, because it's not a quick thing. It's not a thing that we're gonna like, that anyone is gonna solve either in their own lives, in their own sort of small locus of control, their own hearts, their own minds, or in the larger world in 3 months or in 2 weeks or in you know your 4-year strategic plan for your institution or whatever. Like it's not, like you understand it to be, Mahomet Kaba Akbar said, you understand it to be like horizontal work, right? Which is to say, like, it's always sort of out there. But if you're going to stay walking always to out there, like, you got to take a rest. And you also have to be determined to keep walking even as you're taking a rest, because it's really easy to just stop.
Yeah, and I felt like when I was reading the book, part of that work is like that hard work is this like self exploration, right? Of like, who am I? What have I been feeling? What have I been processing? That seemed like a lot of hard work. And so there's actually a question that's come in about names and a little bit of hip hop, because I think that's part of the exploration there of these poems about your name, right? And some of them are funny, and some of them wrestle with some hard things. Question is, what was the interest in the name or in your name? Wondering if it's connected at all to your time as an MC. The book mentions Mos Def, Jay-Z, Talib Kweli. Made me think of how there's a lot of reflection by rappers and their names, and then they throw in a lyric in here. Kweli says, "My name is in the middle of equality."
Yeah.
Mos Def says, "Just my name is a daily word." There seems to be a big emphasis on names in hip hop. Wondering if you were exploring that, if that has anything to do with your role in hip hop.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Yeah, Mos Def says, "I'm most definite, not think so," right? And also, like, there's a point at which he kind of is coming into himself in a different way, religiously and politically and all this stuff, and expatriating from the U.S. and doing all this, is when he also moves away from the name Mos Def and is like, "Nah, I'm Yasin Bey." That being a kind of like name he had already taken privately, but to say like, no, this is now also my stage name, right? This is who I am in all spaces and who I always sort of want to be. Yeah, I mean, definitely. I'm always thinking about what it means for MCs to take on various names, right? And how that is a kind of signal a lot of times, and sometimes it's small and kind of silly things, like Snoop is Snoop because like his family called him because they thought he looked like Snoopy, right? But like, yeah, like even like that's such a sweet story for like this dude that was like the scariest gangster rapper of the mid '90s or whatever, right? But it's like, no, he's just named after a fucking cartoon. Like, that's hilarious. So I think about like the kind of, I love naming stories and sort of naming histories, like the way in West Africa there's that tradition of like, you give a child a name based off of like their sex and what day they were born, and then you sort of wait and give them another name based off of like who they seem to be like, right? What they seem to embody. And you have to kind of wait for that one. So like that's a thing I think about. I also think about my own relationship to my own name. Like I'm named after my mom's first cousin. Like Nathaniel was his middle name, and then my middle name is my grandfather and great grandfather's name. And I think like, like names are an interesting place for me to kind of start an exploration, because they always tell a story, even if that story is one that's fractured or it's one that's sort of where there are gaps, right? Like, like I don't have, like I can only trace my last name back really two generations, you know, and like what does that mean or whatever. But I just like, yeah, I mean, long ass answer to like a short question. Yes, it was definitely thinking about like hip hop as a sort of space where people do choose to either take names or to step into their real names as a kind of like affirmation. So Kendrick Lamar or Kanye West saying, no, my name is actually flying up.
Yeah.
But also, that has a much sort of longer history. So thinking about, you know, how Malcolm Little becomes Malcolm X, becomes El Haj Malik El Shabazz, how Cassius Clay becomes Muhammad Ali, or becomes Cassius X, then becomes Muhammad Ali. And even around that, there's this whole politic of like, you know, I'm gonna call the boy Cassius because that's what his mama named him, you know, or, you know, Ali like beating the brakes off of Sonny Liston because he wouldn't call him Muhammad Ali after he had said, "This is my name," right? I think there's like a long, I don't know. I'm like, I think they're so cool.
There's a question coming in here about form, I think, and it has to do with something I was just thinking. Is that question about hip hop made me think of? I was just talking to a friend about there's this old documentary. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's called Scratch.
Absolutely, yeah,
Right. Scratch classic documentary. And in the beginning, I forget who they asked, what DJ they asked, but they asked him like, "What's hip hop to you?" And he says, "Hip hop is a question. Hip hop is what's next."
uh-huh.
And essentially arguing that like hip hop is this sort of opportunity to always develop it and grow the art and do something different when you do something next. So there's a question here about that in your poem, Only Boy. What does it say here? There was the book club chatted about the book club chatted about those who read the order of the upside down stanzas in the physical book and had a different experience than those who listened to the audiobook. Was this intentional? So there's an audiobook for those that don't know, right? And it's you reading the audiobook. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was a bit intentional, but I think it's also just like, in some ways, the limitation of the audio book. Like, I'm really glad we got to do the audio book because, you know, obviously there are ways that it creates different avenues of accessibility for folks. But I do also, I mean, it's sort of both ways, right? Like, when you hear me read a poem, then you get to thinking this is the way the poem is to be read, and that's not necessarily my intention. But yeah, I mean, I guess like to talk about Only Boy specifically, right? Like that form kind of came from one just wanting to like play on the page in a different sort of way. And what that form really reminds me of is like double dutch, you know. So like, you know, if you ever like jump double dutch or seen folks jump double dutch, you know, it's these sort of two ropes like switching back and forth. And so that inversion made some sense to me as a kind of physical representation of that. But I wasn't exactly, I didn't have like strong impulses about how, in some ways to me, that's a poem that could kind of be read in any order, right? Which I think is sort of like fun about it, right? Like, it's a sort of contrapuntal.
Yeah, so there's a question in here coming in about what's interesting here, and I was thinking about this too. There's so many threads in your book, and you were just talking about earlier about so many threads that are, as I said earlier, it was so well organized. And I heard you say earlier with Jamila about how like you're reading it and you're finding references that you didn't know you were making. So there's a question here that is kind of related to that about did you, in the writing of this book, it often felt like an exploration of history, of the power of language, and a lot of other threads. Was there anything new that you learned in the process of putting this book together, or now revisiting it as you're reading from it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there definitely were things. I mean, one thing that was just like, I think, true for me was I realized, when I sort of started the kind of journey of writing this book, I knew like, oh yeah, I'm not smart enough to write the book that I want to write yet. And so there was a lot of kind of like reading and thought and engagement with like certain kinds of text, whether that's like, kind of revisiting something like All About Love by Bell Hooks, or like reading, more sort of like history. So like reading like the queer history of United States, or even Max Kendi's historical book. Like that sort of history of racist ideas was really useful. So I think like going back to the poems now in a sort of reading, I see all that work, right? I recognize that kind of growth, and I also recognize like, man, like there's a way that when you're in it, like you kind of don't see it, but I'm like, man, I was real sad during some of these, or I was like very happy or whatever. Like, but there is a kind of like emotional tie sometimes to where poems came out of. That now it's sort of nice to be able to like look at, good, bad, and otherwise, and being like, oh, that's like a thing I went through, and now I can sort of think about what were the kind of takeaways for me from that, like what does that then mean about how I like step forward in the world, how I meet the world next.
Yeah, that said, a lot of people thank you for that L poem. It was one of the sad poems in there, but
yeah,
at the same time, there's sort of like beauty to connecting to these feelings, to the city, to right.
I mean, the thing about the like, how can I say this? In some ways, like this, like somewhat. I hesitate to say this because I don't want like to come off the wrong way, but like sometimes the sad poems are just like the most fire.
Yeah.
It's not because like, the worst things about you are the things that are going to make the best art. I don't believe that. But I do think that there's a way that sadness as an emotion, or like melancholy as an emotion, it pushes you into a lyric space in a way that, and I mean lyric like how poets say it, not like how rappers say it. But yeah, it pushes you into a kind of lyric space that can be really productive, right? Like, because when you're, like when you have the sort of experience, the breakup or whatever, that makes you write the L poem, right? You're not trying to be like, well, like these are the ways I was shitty in a relationship, and these are the things my partner didn't do well, and then this is, who broke up with who and why and how, and I cried for this many hours or what. You don't want to do that. You just want to be like, is it like the train? And it's like, what I mean? And so there's like, maybe it's a kind of like almost emotional avoidance because when you're still in it, you can't yet bear to look it in its face. But there's a way that I think that sadness like will make, it just makes you sort of like, it can get really imagistic in a way that sometimes doesn't always happen with when you're like feeling fine. Because when you're feeling fine, you're like, oh yeah, I had a good day. I like went to we like went shopping and we like ate some good food. Like it's very easy to say what happened when you're like having a great day.
Yeah. All right, last question here. It's a hard one. Nate, can you share this playlist with us? And how do we find this playlist?
Yeah, I saw that on the YouTube, so I like posted it in there. But I'm happy to like share it with you, Miguel, and you can like throw people.
All right, sounds good. Sounds good. Well, I want to thank you, Nate, Jamila Woods. Thank you so much for joining us today, for doing this. It's really a pleasure, especially as a Southside Chicagoan right here too. To have you both here talking about this book, this amazing book. You all can find it at local bookstores. You can order it. you can check out some of our partner bookstores on our website and order from them, local bookstores here in Chicago. So I want to thank you both for joining us today. Um, Everyone, I want to thank you all for joining us too, and I want to give you a heads up. We have a Lit Luz festival that we do every year. This year, we're doing it virtual, October 3rd through the 9th. It's going to be a series of virtual programs. Lit Luz fosters creation and new art through international collaboration and central dialogues between residents of Mexico and the United States. Through conversations, creation of new art, writers, artists, and musicians, they will be participating in something we're calling Remix, Respond, and Rebuild. It will consider past festivals while also responding to issues and events currently impacting the US and Mexico. The full lineup is on our website and litluz.org. And I need to mention this because there's also another Chicago writer, Jose Olivares, will be one of our hosts for the virtual festival. Make Literary Productions se enorgullece en presentar el séptimo Festival Anual de Lenguaje, Literatura, Arte y Luz, Luz del 3 al 9 de octubre, como una serie de programas virtuales. Este año lo vamos a hacer virtual. El festival fomenta la creación de arte nuevo a través de la colaboración entre artistas de México y Estados Unidos y crea diálogos esenciales entre los residentes de ambos países. A través de conversaciones, la creación de arte, los escritores, artistas y músicos serán parte del festival Remix, Respond y Rebuild y reconsiderarán temas de ediciones pasadas del festival y al mismo tiempo responderán a problemas y eventos que actualmente están pasando en los Estados Unidos y en México. La programación completa y el calendario de eventos están disponibles en nuestra página web, litluz.org. I also need to thank a few people. John from Q4, Camila for helping us tonight too. And there's a ton of other folks that I know I'm forgetting, but thanks everyone that helped tonight. I also need to mention that tonight's music features Flotando, that song you heard in the start of the show. It's Flotando by Alma Fuerte, which is the solo project by Dos Santos, Jaime Garza. So check out their music. Thank you so much for joining us. We have a few more events coming up, so you go to our webpage, litluz.org, to check out what's coming up. And for sure, save the dates for the Lit Luz Virtual Festival, which will be October 3rd through the 9th. Thank you all. Have a good night, and get Finna. Get that book. Check it out.